Good morning. Happy Sabbath. Today we are continuing our year-long series on questions with the big question of who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? This is a big question that I think a lot of times we don't give the proper weight to when it comes to asking or trying to figure out this question of who is my neighbor. Speaking of neighbors, one of my biggest fears, I guess, when I go on vacation or leave the house for any length of time is that, maybe it's going to get broken into. When you're not home, maybe something's going to happen. Or perhaps, it might catch fire and you'll come home to just a pile of ashes, right? Well, when Chris and I got back from our recent trip, we were glad to see that none of that had happened. But we found out that something really unusual did happen. While we were gone, there happened to be a boy or a young teenage boy that decided to set up shop on our patio, our front porch. His mom parked in front of our house, and they proceeded to engage in a scam, trying to basically steal people's high-valued sneakers. There's a big market for sneakers out there, and I guess the scam was, this is my house. I'm just, the mom was even in on it, saying this is where we live, and he just up there on the porch, and so he would take these sneakers and say, let me go get my money or something from the back, and would just take and go to our backyard and jump the fence and run away, or something along those lines. So we found out about this because of our neighbors. Our neighbor noticed something was wrong, something was unusual was happening, and called the police and got that issue taken care of. Thankfully, and they came back again, and so they had to call the police a second time, apparently. They were really intent on running a scam from our house. And who knows what would have happened if our neighbors hadn't been looking out, right? Hadn't been there being a good neighbor to us. And I think something along those lines is how we would answer that question, who is our neighbor, right? Someone that cares for us or is near to us, close to us, and we might even stretch that to, family member or friends, even if they might not be close proximity, they're close to us, emotionally. And so those are our neighbors, those that look out for our best interests, that have our best interests at heart. That's maybe how most of us would define who our neighbor is. But when you read the teachings of Jesus, you'll find that he really broadens the definition of neighbor. In fact, if you've been a Christian for pretty much any length of time, you've probably come across this teaching where Jesus expands this concept, this definition of neighbor so broadly that basically it boils down to everyone, right? If you've been a Christian, you've probably heard a pastor preach, even probably heard me say something along those lines, that really what being a neighbor is being a neighbor to everyone. And so you might think, well, great, I've heard that, so I can take a nap right now. It's been a long week. I can just catch some Z's right now. But please don't, because this really is a big question. Who is my neighbor is a really big question. And we're going to delve into why it's such a big question. It's a big question because it is directly connected to maybe one of the biggest questions ever. And I'm not just talking about the biggest question for Christians or the biggest question for Americans or the biggest question for 2017. It's connected to one of the biggest questions in the history of humanity. And what is the big question that it's connected to? Well, we find this question in Luke chapter 10, verse 25. Luke, this doctor that uses education, his training to research and compile the life and teachings of Jesus into his gospel, he writes that just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, questions don't get any bigger than that, do they? What do I have to do to live forever? This is a question that people have been asking since time began, really. What can I do? What do I need to do to have immortality? Do I need to search for the fountain of youth? Do I need to do this or have this magic spell? What do I need to do so that I can live forever? And this is what this lawyer asked Jesus. This big, huge, tremendous question. What do I have to do to inherit eternal life? Then Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" You're a lawyer, Jesus says. You're an expert in the law. How do you read this law? What do you find when you read? What are the things that jump out to you when it comes to inheriting eternal life? This is something that you've dedicated your entire adult life to. You've been studying the law. You've been memorizing the law for years, for decades. So you're an expert in it. What is it that you read when it comes to inheriting eternal life? As a lawyer responds, he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." This lawyer, he says, in my expert opinion, I've come to the conclusion that in order to inherit eternal life, I have to do two things. I have to love God with all of who I am, and I have to love my neighbor as myself. Now, this is something that Jesus himself said in other places in the Gospels. You know, if you remember, if you studied, you've come across Jesus saying that the entire law and the prophets boil down to two things. The two greatest commandments, or the greatest commandment is two parts: love God and love your neighbor, love man. And so here the lawyer says, yes, I've read the law myself. I've read the Old Testament, and I can see the two main principles here are completely loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. Now, whether or not this is reflecting on something that Jesus has said previously, or whether he is really expressing his own research, it doesn't matter. What matters is that these are the two greatest commands. This is what eternal life boils down to. And so Jesus says in verse 28, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." Jesus says, yes, you've got it. You've nailed it. You've hit it out of the park. You couldn't have given a better answer. You know the answer to your question because you've just said it. And if you do this, then that's all that you need to worry about. If you love God completely and you love your neighbor as yourself, then that's it. Then you will have inherited eternal life. And that could have been it. I mean, that should have been it, right? Porky Pig could have gone up on the screen and said, "Abadi, abadi, abadi," that's all, folks, right? They could have gone off on their merry way and that would have been it. Because that's all there was. I mean, the big question, the biggest question, and had a really good answer, a really deep answer, profound answer, and that should have settled the matter. But it didn't. There was still something nagging that lawyer. There was still something wrong with that answer. There was still something more that lawyer was searching for. Verse 29, but wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" He couldn't just say, yes, okay, love God and love my neighbor. The verse says that he needed to justify himself. Because in his mind, there had to be a category of people that were not considered his neighbors. He needed to justify his actions, his beliefs, his opinions, his viewpoints, that there were a group of people out there that he did not need to love as he loved himself. He needed a justification for his previous action and his desired continued action of non-love for a certain group of people. Who is my neighbor? This is the question that connects to the biggest question. Who is it that I have to love as myself in order to inherit eternal life? Because there has to be some other people that I don't have to love. So tell me, who is my neighbor? See, he had this mindset of us versus them. There's a group that is good. There's a group that I consider myself a part of. And then there's a group that's not. There's them. And there's a definite line between us. What's that line, Jesus? In fact, that mindset of us versus them is not just contained to that era of human history. The mindset of us versus them is a mindset that has continued throughout time. That mindset of us versus them is a mindset that people have in 2017, that Christians have, that Seventh-day Adventists have, that some of us in this church right now have. Us versus them. There's a line, or there's several lines that change, that separate who should be with us and who should be against us. There are lines that make a distinction between who is our neighbor and who isn't our neighbor. And throughout history, those lines seem to be fairly similar. It's the people that come from a different country. That's not our neighbor. It's the people that speak a different language. That's not our neighbor. It's the people that behave differently than us, have different customs than us. It's the people that have a different belief system, a different religion than us. That's not our neighbor. The people that don't look like us, that don't act like us, that don't believe like us, those are the people that aren't our neighbors, because our neighbors are the ones that I can identify with. My neighbor is the people that I have things in common with. My neighbor is the people that I like being around, that look like me, talk like me, think like me. People that I connect with. This us versus them mentality. Jesus knows that this is not the mentality of heaven. Jesus knows that this us versus them is not the mentality that he wants his followers to have. And so he tells maybe one of his most well-known parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now we're going to spend a few minutes looking at this parable from a perspective that you might expect from me if you've come and heard me preach before. I mean, I'm not going to present this parable in an unusual way. I'm not going to burst out into song or anything like that. If you want to hear this parable told through singing, come next week. Because next week, the school is going to be here. The kids are working and are preparing a tremendous program called the Not So Terrible Parable, where they are going to present the story of the Good Samaritan from their point of view, from a different point of view. And I think I was talking with Principal Byerly this week, and he said, well, I don't know, Pastor. If you're preaching about it one Sabbath and we do it the next Sabbath, are you trying to steal our thunder? I'm like, there's no way I can steal the elementary school's thunder. You need to come and hear that thunder full force next week at 11 o'clock, and you'll definitely be blessed. But this parable, Jesus begins in Luke chapter 10, verse 30. Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead." A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And it literally means going down, because Jerusalem is on a hill, on a mountain, Mount Zion. Jericho is down more closer to the Jordan River Valley. And you can see on the map here where Jerusalem and Jericho is. And you can see the route that connects them, that blue dotted line. It is known as the Wadi Kelt. The Wadi Kelt is where they built the route that connects these two major important cities of Jesus' day. People would travel this route frequently, and a lot of them would be merchants, going from the capital of Jerusalem to a big important city of Jericho. They would be carrying their monies or their wares or their produce, their products. And this became an important route, but it also became a very dangerous route because along this route, robbers liked to hide. There's caves along this route where robbers would hide out in and provided perfect cover and hiding spots for robbers and thieves and bandits. And in fact, this route, 2 Sabbath mornings ago, I had the privilege of walking. A group from our tour group took this path and hiked for 10 miles between Jerusalem and Jericho. Here you can see this is where it began. The path, this is what it looks like right now as you begin the journey from Jericho, or from Jerusalem rather, to Jericho. The path kind of snakes up there in the bottom left-hand corner. Doesn't look too inviting, does it? But this was the path. This was the route. And you can see some of the intrepid travelers coming down the path there. It's not too wide, not such a big path. But as we traveled, from time to time we would see locals coming by, riding their donkeys. I'm like, man, I wish I had a donkey right now. Make the 10-mile journey much quicker. But it wasn't all barren. Kelt, after all, is the Arabic term for valley or ravine that carries water at least part of the year. And so along throughout the Kelt, there's a stream of water, and you could see with the green the vegetation that would grow there by the water. And in fact, we went up to the springs, and at the springs that fed this water through the Kelt, there's a series of small waterfalls where some of the locals were enjoying the refreshing water on the hot day as we walked by. And as we walked part of the way next to the channel that they've created to carry the water down from those springs down to the Jordan River. And we walked along the water for quite some time. It was nice to be able to, when it's especially hot, just to go in and rinse your hands or put some water on your forehead and cool down a little bit. But it was important, this water going through this valley. This is why the route from Jerusalem to Jericho went along this route, so the travelers would have access to water and refreshment for themselves and for their animals. But as you can see, there's some caves. We passed cave after cave that served as perfect hideouts for robbers along this very important route. There on the right, you can see them. You can almost imagine the robbers hiding in there, ready to pounce on another victim. And there, as we get a little closer to Jerusalem, to Jericho, you can see just how high up the path was from the bottom of the river valley or the Kelt Valley. Those are us, the people. You can see little lines kind of at the top walking along. So you can imagine that there's really no way to escape a bandit that's camped out right on front of that path. You can't really get up. You can't go down without probably suffering a tremendous injury, possibly death. And in fact, this valley, this Wadi Kelt Valley, many people believe is the valley that the psalmist had in mind in Psalm 23 when he said, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Because this was a treacherous, dangerous route to be walking. Now, by chance, Jesus continues with this parable. A priest was going down that road, and when he saw the man that had been left for dead, he passed by on the other side. Now, this would have been shocking to his listeners, would have been shocking to the lawyer. Because, as you can see, it says by chance. Implying that this man's luck had changed. He had had bad luck up to that point. These robbers had set upon him and beat him and stolen and left him for dead. But by chance, a priest had come along. Things were looking up. Things were turning around. That if anyone was going to help him, a priest was going to help this man that was in desperate need of help. But the priest doesn't help. In fact, Jesus takes it a step further. He doesn't say just the priest kind of stepped over him. He says the priest went to the other side of the road to get as far away from this man that was in desperate need of help as possible. The priest refused to help this man. And this would have been shocking. But Jesus doesn't stop there. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. A Levite came by. Now, Levites and priests were different. Priests were the ones that had the high official religious responsibilities in the temple. The Levites also worked in the temple, but they did kind of the more the other kind of work that kept the temple running, with caring for the animals and moving their furniture and sweeping up and just keeping the temple running smoothly. But they too were this group of people that were regarded with high esteem and high regard. And if a priest didn't stop to help this man, surely a Levite would have stopped to offer help to this man that was half dead. But he didn't either. The priest goes by on the other side. The Levite goes by on the other side. And again, the listeners to this parable would have been shocked. Of all the people to help, it should have been the priest or the Levite. Now, Jesus doesn't say why they didn't stop. He doesn't explain why they went to the other side. Perhaps it was because they were trying to avoid any ritual impurity. Maybe they had a religious function to attend to and they couldn't be unclean by maybe touching someone that was possibly dead. Or perhaps it was more basic than that. Maybe they didn't want to get robbed either. If they saw, someone just did this to this guy, I want to get far away as fast as possible from this dangerous area. Jesus doesn't explain. The parable doesn't explain. But what is very obvious is that they did not do what they should have done for this man, for this Jew that was in dire need of help. But a third person comes on the scene. Verse 33 says, a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. And when he saw him, he was moved with pity. A Samaritan saw this Jew that had been beaten and stripped and robbed and left for dead, and the Samaritan was moved with pity. This, again, would have been even more shocking to that audience that Jesus was speaking to than the fact that the priest hadn't paid any attention to this man. Because a Samaritan, of all people, well, they were the least likely to offer any help. If you probably had polled the audience that Jesus was speaking to, and just asked them who would be the most likely and the least likely to help someone in need, they would have said the most likely would be a priest. The least likely would have been a Samaritan. And yet, here Jesus says, a Samaritan saw this man, this Jew, and was moved with pity. This would have been so shocking to the Jews that Jesus was speaking to. It would have been like them saying, it would have been like Jesus addressing a group of African Americans and saying, and then a Ku Klux Klan member came and saw this man and had pity on him. Or it would be like Jesus addressing a group of Christians and saying, and then an ISIS soldier came and saw a Christian and had pity on him. This would have been mind-blowing to the crowd. I mean, imagine me saying, oh yeah, there was a church member and then an elder came by and didn't care for the person in need, and then a deacon came by and didn't care for a person in need, but then an ISIS general came by and helped them out, right? You're like, what? That's crazy. This is the reaction that the people were having to this parable. And the Samaritan didn't just have pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. And then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. See, Samaritans and Jews, they were just natural born enemies, basically. The Samaritans, they were considered half-breeds by the Jews. They were the ones that remained when Israel had been invaded by Assyria, and most of them had been taken off to Assyria as captives. These were the ones that stayed and basically intermarried with the Assyrians. And so the Jews considered them to be traitors to their religion, traitors to their lineage, traitors to everything that they should have held dear. And that is why they considered Samaritans to be unclean. They considered them to be vile. They considered them to be corrupt. And they were so divided that they had their own place of worship. The Jews would worship in the temple on Mount Zion, but the Samaritans had created their own temple on Mount Gerizim. They were so completely divided, and there was just this antipathy, this hatred towards each other. And the fact that this Samaritan came and poured medicine on this man's wounds, bound him up and put him on his own animal, this was crazy. And he didn't even just stop there. Verse 35 says, the next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him. And when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. He didn't just take care of him and say, okay, well, I bandaged your wounds now, good luck. He took out money and he paid for this man's continued recovery. It says he took out 2 denarii. When I was in Israel, I bought a denarii. This is what a denarii looks like. This is about the 1 day's wage back then. And if you can't see what this looks like, here's a picture of it. This was the standard, the most common coin of currency, one of the most common in those days. Like I said, 1 denarii was 1 day's wage. So he paid 2 days' wages for this man, this Jew, to stay convalescing in the hospital, in the inn. And they said that would work out to be about 2.5 weeks. He paid for about 2 or 2.5 weeks for the man to stay at the inn, and promised that if he cost the innkeeper any more, he would repay on his return journey. Then Jesus says, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to this man that was in need of mercy? Was it the priest? Was it the Levite? Was it the Samaritan? Was it the people that looked like this Jew, that acted like this Jew, that believed like this Jew? Or was it this enemy of the Jew? Which one of these 3 was the neighbor? And the lawyer said, the one who showed him mercy. The lawyer couldn't even bring himself to say Samaritan. Even after all of that, he still couldn't see past the fact that Jesus was trying to get him to break down this us versus them mindset. And he couldn't even say the word Samaritan. He only could bring himself to say the one who showed him mercy. This is who the neighbor was, the one who showed the man mercy. And Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. Jesus says, you want to know who your neighbor is? If you really want to inherit eternal life, this was the big, grand, major question that you asked me. And then you try to weasel out by asking me this other question of who is my neighbor. If you really want to know who your neighbor is, because you really want to inherit eternal life, your neighbor is the person that needs mercy. It doesn't matter what they look like. It doesn't matter what they believe. It doesn't matter if they act like you, talk like you. It doesn't matter if you like them. What matters is, do you see that they are created in the image of God, just as you are? What matters is, do you show them mercy like you would want to be shown mercy? If you were the person beaten and robbed and left for dead on the side of the road, would you care who saved your life? No, right? You'd be like, oh, man, I can't believe a Samaritan helped me. I'm just going to go and kill myself, right? You're like, no, that's weird. I don't know why, but thank you, right? We would be grateful for anyone that showed us mercy in those circumstances. And Jesus says exactly, you need to show that mercy to anyone and everyone, because there is no us versus them. In heaven, there is going to be no us versus them. If you want to have eternal life, if you want to live forever, guess what? You are not going to live forever if you maintain that mindset of us versus them, because that goes against the very principles and foundation of heaven. In heaven, there is no Jew or Gentile. In heaven, there is no slave or free. In heaven, there is no male or female. In heaven, there is no us versus them. In heaven, there is only us. Jesus says, the point of being my follower, the point of loving God with your whole heart and mind and soul and body, is to love every other person like yourself. That's how you show, that's how your complete love for God manifests itself in this world. Because if you really do love God with all of who you are, you cannot help but show mercy to every other person on the face of this planet. If you really truly love God with every fiber of your being, you are not going to be able to maintain an us versus them mentality. If you truly love God completely, you're going to see that we are all together as neighbors. So the question, who is my neighbor? It's not someone that looks like us, that talks like us, that's from the same country as us, it's from the same neighborhood or block or street as us. Our neighbor is everyone that bears the image of God. Our neighbor is everyone that is in need of mercy. Who is my neighbor? Everyone. Everyone.